Hey guys, tonight we begin with something light, something cozy, something soothing. An event that buried half the planet under miles of ice for tens of thousands of years. So, relaxing stuff. Go ahead and dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket. Imagine the air getting just a little colder, not painfully cold, just crisp. Just enough that you can picture your breath in front of you. Because tonight, we're drifting back to the last ice age, the long one, the dramatic one, the one that made woolly mammoths look like reasonable fashion choices. And don't worry, there won't be jump scares, no sudden avalanches, just a slow, steady glide through a world that gradually turned into a giant freezer. So, settle in. Let's begin. About 2.6 million years ago, Earth entered a period scientists call the Pleistocene epoch, which sounds very official, very dignified, but what it really means is things were about to get chilly for a very long time. Now, here's something people often misunderstand. The Ice Age was not one continuous, non-stop snowstorm. It wasn't just glaciers aggressively bulldozing everything for 100,000 straight years, like nature had decided to redecorate in white. Instead, it was a series of cold phases called glacial periods, and in between them were warmer stretches called interglacials. Think of it as Earth breathing slowly, cold, less cold, cold again, less cold again. Very dramatic breathing. The last major glacial period began around 115,000 years ago, and it peaked roughly 20,000 years ago. That peak is called the last glacial maximum, which sounds like a winter sports event, but was actually a time when ice sheets covered enormous portions of North America, Northern Europe, and parts of Asia. If you were standing where Chicago is today, you would not be admiring skyline architecture. You would be under a mile of ice, just quietly existing beneath what was essentially a continental ice cube. And honestly, that ice sheet had no interest in your real estate ambitions. The reason all of this happened has to do with something delightfully subtle: tiny wobbles in Earth's orbit. These are known as Milankovitch cycles, named after a Serbian mathematician who decided that instead of doing something simple, he would calculate long-term changes in planetary motion. Because why not? Earth's orbit isn't perfectly stable. It changes shape slightly over tens of thousands of years. The tilt of Earth's axis shifts. The direction it points slowly wobbles. And those small changes affect how sunlight is distributed across the planet. When summers in the northern hemisphere become slightly cooler, snow from the previous winter doesn't fully melt, it sticks around. Then more snow piles on top the next year, and the next. Over thousands of years, that snow compresses into ice. And just like that, you've accidentally built a glacier the size of a small country. Ice reflects sunlight, so the more ice there is, the more sunlight gets bounced back into space, which makes things even colder, which makes more ice, which reflects more sunlight. Earth, at this point, is basically doubling down on winter. By the time we reach the height of the last ice age, ice sheets covered Canada, much of the northern United States, Scandinavia, and large parts of Britain and northern Europe. Sea levels were about 120 meters lower than they are today. That's nearly 400 feet. Entire coastlines looked completely different. There was more land, vast stretches of it. The English Channel, often dry land. The Bering Strait between Siberia and Alaska, a land bridge called Beringia, which will become very important later, quietly important, in a slow, glacial kind of way. But before we get to humans, let's just float gently over the landscape. Picture it. massive ice sheets creeping south, not rushing, not sprinting, just slowly grinding forward. Glaciers can move a few inches per day, which doesn't sound impressive, but over centuries they reshape continents. They carve valleys, they flatten hills, they bulldoze forests. If a glacier had a personality, it would be that quiet coworker who says nothing for months and then suddenly reorganizes the entire office. Underneath these ice sheets, the weight was so immense that the Earth's crust actually sank. In some regions, it was pressed down hundreds of meters. And here's the mildly fascinating part. Even today, thousands of years after the ice melted, some of those regions are still rebounding upward, like a memory foam mattress very slowly remembering its original shape. Scandinavia is still rising, Canada too. The planet is still adjusting from the Ice Age's very heavy presence. Meanwhile, beyond the ice sheets, the world wasn't exactly tropical bliss either. It was colder and drier almost everywhere. Grasslands expanded, forests shrank, deserts grew in some regions. The Sahara at times behaved very differently than it does today. Climate shifted constantly over these tens of thousands of years. Nothing was stable for long. And in this shifting world, life adapted. Let's drift toward the animals. The Ice Age megafauna are often what people imagine first, and honestly, they deserve it. These creatures were large, impressively large, almost suspiciously large. Woolly mammoths were basically elephants wearing winter coats, long, curved tusks, shaggy hair, fat reserves to survive brutal winters. Then there were woolly rhinoceroses, giant ground sloths in the Americas, saber-toothed cats with teeth that looked slightly impractical but very dramatic, short-faced bears, massive bison, dire wolves. If evolution during the Ice Age had a motto, it might be, when in doubt, make it bigger and fluffier. Larger bodies retain heat better, thick fur helps, layers of fat help. Being enormous also discourages predators, or at least makes them reconsider their life choices. And yet, these giants lived in a world of scarcity. Winters were long, vegetation could be limited, herds migrated constantly across vast steppe landscapes known as Mammoth Steppe. This ecosystem stretched from Europe across Siberia and into North America. Cold, dry grasslands that supported huge grazing animals. It wasn't endless snow everywhere. Many regions were actually dry and windswept. Cold, yes, but more like a frozen prairie than a snow globe. Now let's slowly bring in the humans. By the time of the last Ice Age, Homo sapiens had already emerged in Africa. Modern humans appear around 300,000 years ago, which means when the ice sheets were expanding, we were already around, just trying to make it work. Early humans in Africa experienced cooler, drier climates too. Lakes expanded and shrank, grasslands shifted, resources moved, and humans, being humans, followed.
Around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, groups of modern humans began migrating out of Africa. Slowly, over generations, not in one dramatic march, but in small bands exploring new territories. They entered the Middle East, then Europe, then Asia. And Europe, during the Ice Age, was brisk. When modern humans arrived there, they weren't alone. Another human species already lived there, the Neanderthals. Neanderthals had been in Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. They were adapted to cold climates, stockier builds, broad noses, muscular frames. They knew the terrain. So when Homo sapiens arrived, it wasn't an empty continent. It was already occupied by cousins who had mastered Ice Age living. For thousands of years they coexisted.
There was some competition, some cultural overlap, and yes, some interbreeding, which is why many people today carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA. A quiet reminder that the Ice Age was socially complicated. Neanderthals eventually disappeared around 40,000 years ago. The reasons are still debated. Climate fluctuations, competition, smaller populations, maybe all of it combined. And so Homo sapiens continued alone across Europe, adapting to the cold. They built shelters from wood, bone, and animal hides. In some places, mammoth bones were used as structural frames, which is both resourceful and slightly intimidating. Imagine living in a house made of enormous curved tusks. They hunted large animals, mammoths, bison, reindeer. Hunting required cooperation, planning, tools made of stone, bone, and ivory. Clothing became essential. Tailored garments stitched with bone needles appear in the archaeological record because frostbite is not fashionable. Fire was life. It provided warmth, light, protection, and the ability to cook food. Campsites were carefully chosen for shelter from wind. Rivers provided water and migration routes. And through all of this, art emerged. Cave paintings in places like Lascaux and Chauvet in France show animals in vivid motion, bison, horses, mammoths. Even in a harsh Ice Age world, humans paused to paint, to create, to imagine. There's something deeply calming about that. While glaciers crept across continents and temperatures dropped, someone was grinding pigment and tracing the curve of a horse onto stone. The Ice Age was not constant misery. It was challenge, adaptation, movement. And time moved slowly, in tens of thousands of years. Around 20,000 years ago, at the last glacial maximum, the ice sheets were at their greatest extent. Sea levels were low. The planet was at one of its coldest points in this long cycle. But even then, change had already begun. Earth's orbit shifted again. Summers in the northern hemisphere slowly grew warmer. Not dramatically, not overnight, just slightly more sunlight, slightly more melting. Glaciers began to retreat, and they retreated the way they had advanced, slowly, patiently, leaving behind carved valleys, moraines, and lakes. The Great Lakes of North America, largely shaped by retreating ice sheets. Those vast inland seas are Ice Age souvenirs. As the ice melted, sea levels rose, coastlines shifted inward. Beringia flooded, cutting off the land bridge between Asia and North America. But before it flooded completely, humans had crossed it. Sometime before 15,000 years ago, possibly earlier, groups of humans moved from Siberia into the Americas. They followed herds, they explored, they adapted. They entered a new continent that had never seen Homo sapiens before. And quietly, gently, the peopling of the Americas began. All of this happened while the Ice Age was winding down. The last glacial period came around 11,700 years ago. That marks the beginning of our current epoch, the Holocene, which is, technically speaking, an interglacial, a warm pause in the broader Ice Age cycle. Yes, we are technically still in an Ice Age, just in a warm intermission. The great ice sheets are mostly gone, except for Greenland and Antarctica. Sea levels stabilized, forests expanded northward,
human societies gradually shifted from hunting and gathering to agriculture in various regions, and civilization, in its many complicated forms, slowly emerged. But beneath our cities and fields, beneath our roads and quiet suburbs, lies the imprint of the last ice age, the shape of valleys, the placement of rivers, the depth of lakes. The very soil in some regions was ground and deposited by glaciers. We live on a landscape sculpted by ice, and the planet, patient as ever, continues its slow orbital dance. Thousands of years from now, if the cycles continue, another glacial period may begin. Ice could advance again, slowly, quietly, without urgency. But for now, we rest in a warmer chapter. So as you settle deeper into your pillow, imagine that ancient cold world, the vast white horizons, the shaggy silhouettes of mammoths against a pale sky, small bands of humans huddled around firelight, the ice moving inch by inch, reshaping continents without saying a word. The last ice age was not a single storm, it was a long, slow story, and tonight we've just begun to drift through it. Close your eyes. The ice is retreating, and the world is quietly, gently warming.
All right. Take a slow breath. We're still in the Ice Age. No sudden warming yet, no dramatic thaw, just wind brushing across endless grasslands and the occasional disgruntled mammoth minding its business. Last time, we left off as the glaciers were beginning their long, dramatic exit. But before they disappear completely, let's linger a little longer in their world. Because the Ice Age was not just about ice, it was about survival. Slow, patient, slightly uncomfortable survival. Picture northern Eurasia around 25,000 years ago. The air is dry, very dry. Snow falls, but not constantly. Much of the landscape is open steppe, flat grassland stretching for miles. It's cold, yes, but it's not always buried under blizzards. It's more like a permanent late November that simply refuses to end. This region, often called the Mammoth Steppe, was one of the largest ecosystems on Earth at the time. It stretched from what is now Spain all the way across Siberia and into North America. And it was crowded. Woolly mammoths roamed in herds, grazing on hardy grasses. Steppe bison moved in thick groups. Wild horses galloped across open land. Reindeer migrated in long seasonal patterns. And somewhere nearby, small human groups were watching them very carefully, because dinner did not deliver itself. Ice Age humans were hunter-gatherers, but that phrase sometimes sounds gentle, peaceful, like they were casually picking berries in a meadow. In reality, survival required constant planning. Migration patterns had to be understood. Animal behavior had to be observed. Weather shifts mattered deeply, and everything moved slowly. Hunting a mammoth, for example, was not a daily activity. It required cooperation, coordination, tools made from carefully shaped stone points attached to wooden spears. There were no metal tips, no convenient sporting goods store, just sharpened rock and determination. A successful mammoth hunt could feed a group for weeks. Meat would be butchered carefully. Fat was precious. Bones were reused for tools. Hides became clothing or shelter coverings. Nothing was wasted, because wasting resources in the Ice Age was a bold and short-lived strategy. But let's gently shift northward. Above the tree line, in even colder zones, some human groups adapted to near-Arctic conditions. They built shelters partially underground to conserve heat. They insulated walls with animal skins.
Fire was constant but carefully maintained. Fuel wasn't always easy to find. In dry, treeless regions, dried animal dung could be burned, which may not sound glamorous, but warmth is warmth. Clothing became surprisingly sophisticated. Archaeological finds suggest layered garments, fur-lined boots, fitted sleeves, tailored shapes that allowed movement while retaining heat. Bone needles found in Siberia show that sewing was not an afterthought, it was essential. Fashion, but make it survival. Meanwhile, let's drift toward Beringia. During the peak of the Ice Age, sea levels were so low that Siberia and Alaska were connected by a wide land bridge. Not a narrow strip, a broad region hundreds of miles across in places. This wasn't just a bridge, it was its own ecosystem. Grasslands, rivers, herds of animals, and humans lived there. For thousands of years, small populations occupied Beringia. Genetic studies suggest that some groups may have been isolated there for a long period before moving further into the Americas. It wasn't a dramatic stampede into a new world. It was gradual, patient, a slow drift eastward following herds and opportunity. As glaciers began retreating around 16,000 to 14,000 years ago, new routes opened southward into North America. Ice-free corridors formed, coastal pathways became accessible, and humans began moving deeper into the continents. By around 13,000 years ago, people were living across much of North America. Soon after, they reached South America. All of this unfolding while the planet was still thawing from its long freeze. But here's where things get gently complicated. Around the same time humans spread widely across the Americas, many large Ice Age animals began disappearing. Mammoths, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, short-faced bears, gone.
The exact cause is still debated. Climate change played a role. Rapid warming altered habitats. Vegetation shifted. Ecosystems reorganized. But human hunting may have added pressure. Even small populations of skilled hunters can significantly impact large animal species over time. It likely wasn't a dramatic overkill event, no sudden extinction party, more like steady pressure in a world already changing quickly. And so the age of megafauna slowly faded. By around 10,000 years ago, most of the iconic Ice Age giants were extinct. A few isolated populations of woolly mammoths survived on Wrangel Island in the Arctic until about 4,000 years ago. Which means mammoths were still around while the pyramids of Egypt were being built. History overlaps in quiet, surprising ways. Now let's ease back into the climate itself. The end of the last Ice Age was not a smooth, gentle warming. It had mood swings. One of the most famous cold snaps occurred about 12,900 years ago. It's called the Younger Dryas. Temperatures in the northern hemisphere suddenly dropped again, almost as if the planet briefly reconsidered this whole warming up idea. This cold period lasted about 1,200 years. The cause is debated, but many scientists believe massive amounts of meltwater from retreating glaciers disrupted ocean circulation patterns, particularly the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. In simpler terms, cold, fresh water interfered with the ocean's heat distribution system. So things cooled again, not full Ice Age levels, but enough to matter. For human groups transitioning toward more settled lifestyles in regions like the Near East, this climate reversal may have influenced their decisions. In the Levant, the Natufian culture had begun experimenting with semi-sedentary living. They harvested wild grains, built stone structures. Then the Younger Dryas made conditions harsher.
Some researchers suggest this pressure encouraged further innovation, perhaps even nudging societies toward agriculture once stable warming resumed. It's a quiet reminder that climate and culture are always intertwined. When the Younger Dryas ended around 11,700 years ago, warming resumed decisively. Glaciers retreated more rapidly, sea levels rose significantly, coastlines shifted inward once again. Large areas that humans had occupied near ancient shores were submerged, which is one reason coastal archaeological sites from the Ice Age are harder to find today. They're underwater now, calmly resting beneath modern seas. Forests expanded northward across Europe and North America. Tundra shrank. Animals adapted or migrated. Human groups adjusted too. In multiple regions around the world, independently, agriculture began to appear within a few thousand years of the Ice Age ending. In the Fertile Crescent, wheat and barley were domesticated. In China, rice cultivation began. In Mesoamerica, maize would eventually be developed. Warmer, more stable climates allowed experimentation with planting and harvesting. Not immediately, not all at once, but gradually. The long Ice Age had trained humanity in flexibility, mobility, cooperation. And now, in the warmth of the Holocene, some groups chose to stay put. Villages formed, then towns, then cities. But beneath every early farm field was soil shaped by glaciers. Beneath every river valley was rock carved by ice. Even today, when you look at fjords in Norway or the Great Lakes in North America, you're seeing the fingerprints of the last Ice Age. Massive forces moving patiently over unimaginable spans of time. So, as you settle a little deeper into rest, imagine that long arc, from creeping glaciers to rising seas, from mammoth hunts to early wheat fields, from endless steppe winds to quiet farming villages. The Ice Age did not end with a dramatic curtain drop. It faded, slowly, leaving behind a reshaped planet and a species that had learned to endure cold horizons and uncertain skies. And tomorrow night, we'll drift even further into the small details of Ice Age life. For now, just picture the last glacier melting at the edge of a quiet valley, water dripping, ice thinning, a world waking up from a very long winter.
All right. The ice is thinning now. Not gone, just retreating with quiet dignity. We're somewhere around 14,000 years ago. The air still carries a bite, but it's softer. Snow lingers only in patches through the warmer months. Rivers run louder now, swollen with meltwater. The world is shifting, but it's doing so slowly. No rush. Glaciers never rush. Imagine standing at the edge of a vast ice sheet as it pulls back. It doesn't collapse overnight. It shrinks year by year, a little less white on the horizon each summer, a little more exposed earth, dark soil where there used to be blinding brightness. And where ice retreats, life follows. First come the hardy plants, mosses, grasses, shrubs that don't mind poor soil and lingering frost. Then small trees. Birch is often among the pioneers, tough, unbothered, the kind of tree that looks at post-glacial chaos and says, "Sure, I can work with this." Animals trail behind vegetation. Reindeer herds adjust their routes. Elk expand into new forests. Wolves follow the elk. And humans, of course, follow everything. Because humans, at this point, are excellent followers, observers, quiet opportunists. Let's drift toward the Near East, specifically the Levant region, modern-day Israel, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon.
Around 13,000 years ago, something subtle begins to happen here. Groups known as the Natophians begin settling more permanently in certain areas. Not full farmers, not yet, but not entirely nomadic either. They build semi-permanent stone houses, small circular structures partially dug into the ground, roofed with branches and reeds. It's not a city, but it's not just a temporary camp either. They harvest wild cereals, wild wheat, wild barley, and here's the interesting part. Instead of simply gathering what grows naturally, they begin to manage it. They clear competing plants. They may even scatter seeds intentionally. Not quite agriculture, more like encouraging nature to cooperate. Because why chase your food endlessly if you can gently convince it to grow nearby? This shift isn't dramatic. No one wakes up and declares we are now farmers. It's gradual, experimental. The Younger Dryas cold period interrupts this warm stability around 12,900 years ago. Temperatures drop again. Conditions become drier in parts of the Near East. Wild cereal yields decrease. And this environmental pressure may have nudged some groups toward more intentional cultivation once warming returned. It's one of those slow domino effects. Climate shifts, food supply tightens, humans adapt. And adaptation during the Ice Age had already been humanity's specialty. Meanwhile, in Europe, forests spread north as the climate stabilizes. Dense woodlands replace open steppe in many areas. Hunting strategies change. You can't easily chase herds across open grassland if trees are in the way. So humans diversify. Smaller game becomes more important. Deer, boar, birds. Fishing intensifies in rivers and lakes newly formed by glacial meltwater. We see more microliths appear in toolkits, tiny, carefully shaped stone blades set into wooden or bone handles. Efficient, replaceable. Technology doesn't leap forward with fireworks. It refines itself quietly. Let's drift to Britain. Around 12,000 years ago, it's still connected to mainland Europe by a stretch of land called Doggerland, a broad, low-lying plain between what is now England and Denmark. People live there, hunt there, walk across it. But as sea levels rise, Doggerland slowly floods, marshes form, then shallow seas. Eventually, the land disappears entirely beneath the North Sea. Imagine generations watching their homeland shrink, not overnight, not in a single storm, but gradually, coastlines inching inward. One day, the path to the continent is gone. Climate change again, but measured in centuries. Now let's float westward to North America. As the massive Laurentide ice sheet retreats, new landscapes emerge. Forests spread across what is now the northeastern United States and eastern Canada. The Great Lakes form from glacial meltwater filling basins carved by ice. The scale is hard to imagine. These lakes are not small ponds, they are vast inland seas, and they owe their existence to ice grinding rock for thousands of years. Human groups adapt to these new freshwater resources. Fishing becomes central in many areas. Canoes likely develop or improved in response to watery environments. Travel by river is efficient, calm, strategic. And as warming continues, bison expand across the Great Plains. Open grasslands return in some regions as forests settle elsewhere. Human cultures diversify across North America. Distinct tool traditions appear, distinct hunting strategies, different adaptations to desert, forest, and tundra environments. There isn't one ice age, there are many, spread across continents. Meanwhile, Megafauna continued disappearing. By 11,000 years ago, mammoths are largely gone from mainland continents, mastodons too. Giant ground sloths vanish from the Americas, saber-toothed cats fade into fossil records. The causes remain debated.
Climate stress certainly played a role. Habitats changed rapidly. Large animals with slow reproductive rates struggled to adapt. Human hunting likely added additional pressure. Even small, well-organized groups can alter population dynamics over time. It wasn't a dramatic extinction event with trumpets and final battles, more like a long fade. The Ice Age giants exit quietly, and the Holocene begins around 11,700 years ago. This marks the official end of the last glacial period. Temperatures stabilize within a relatively narrow range. Seasons become more predictable. And predictable seasons are incredibly valuable if you're thinking about planting things. Let's return to the Near East. By around 10,000 years ago, early farming communities begin to appear. Wheat and barley show signs of domestication. Seeds become larger. Non-shattering varieties are favored, meaning the grains don't fall off the stalk immediately, making harvest easier. Humans unintentionally select for traits beneficial to them. Goats and sheep begin to be managed more intensively. Over time, they too become domesticated, not in one grand moment, in many small decisions. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, similar processes unfold independently. In China, rice cultivation begins in river valleys. In New Guinea, root crops are managed. In Mesoamerica, maize will eventually be domesticated from wild teosinte. All of this following the long stability after the Ice Age. But it's important to remember something. For most of the last Ice Age, humans were not farmers. They were mobile, flexible, adaptive in ways that agriculture would eventually constrain. Agriculture brings stability, yes, but also labor, sedentary life, disease from denser populations, social hierarchies. The Ice Age world, though harsh, allowed for remarkable mobility and resilience. People could move when conditions shifted. They followed herds. They adapted diets. They survived dramatic climate swings. In many ways, the Ice Age trained humanity to be endlessly adaptable. So, as we gently conclude this chapter, imagine that final shift. A world once dominated by glaciers, now green and dotted with small villages, smoke rising from permanent hearths, fields of wild grain growing near settlements, children who have never seen a mammoth, who only hear of them in stories told by grandparents, the cold horizon replaced by rolling hills and forests, and beneath it all, deep layers of glacial sediment, quiet evidence of the long winter that shaped everything. The Ice Age didn't just freeze the planet, it shaped landscapes, redirected rivers, guided migrations, encouraged innovation. It carved valleys into stone and resilience into humanity. And now, as you drift closer to sleep, imagine that ancient world fully thawed, water flowing freely, grass bending in warmer wind, and somewhere in the distance, the last fragment of glacier slipping silently into a mountain lake. The long winter is over, but its story still rests beneath our feet.